It turns out the history in Roe was very biased. It was done by a pro-choice researcher. It was essentially one historian. It wasn't a bunch of different historians and looking at different historical perspectives of these issues. When does life begin? And was abortion a right then? Dobbs sought to correct that part of Roe. And so, of course, you would think that perhaps that could happen again.
Well, howdy everyone, and welcome to the Laura Musica Show. I'm your host, Laura Musica, attorney and president CEO of Sidewalk Advocates for Life. You know, I remember so vividly the moment I learned that the Supreme Court in its Dobbs decision had finally overturned the infamous Roe versus Wade abortion case. I literally burst into tears of joy, almost hesitant to believe the fact that abortion on demand had finally ended in our nation. The miracle that the pro-life, pro-family movement had been working and praying for over the course of 5 decades had actually come to pass. But amid our joy, we weren't naive about the situation. We knew that Dobbs didn't mean the end of abortion in our nation. What it did was return the decision back to the people of each state, giving us the chance to protect innocent human life or not. Now, more than 3 years later, we have states that have banned or greatly restricted abortion. We have states that are so supportive of abortion that they are literally inviting women to flood across their borders to abort their preborn children, what we call abortion destinations. And we continue to see lawsuits launched as the abortion industry tries to fight pro-life legislation in various states so abortionists can end more lives in more places. The seemingly straightforward fact that Roe was overturned has resulted in a landscape that is far from simple to understand or navigate, which is why I'm so excited to welcome constitutional law attorney Elissa Graves to the show to help us see more clearly where we really stand at this particular moment in history and what we can expect, what might lie ahead. So let me go ahead and introduce our special guest. Elissa earned her law degree at the University of Texas School of Law in 2013. While a student at UT, Elissa volunteered with the Central Texas Coalition for Life as a sidewalk counselor and participated in the local 40 Days for Life prayer campaign. She is passionate about empowering women facing unexpected pregnancies and has dedicated her career to making abortion unnecessary and unthinkable. Elissa is currently in private practice representing clients in a range of constitutional law and pro-life matters. She previously worked as legal counsel at Alliance Defending Freedom, where she engaged in litigation to promote a culture of life in the United States and regularly spoke on pro-life topics. She has also made numerous media appearances, including appearing on outlets such as Fox News, The Hill, The New York Times, and NPR. She also serves now as board president of our organization, Sidewalk Advocates for Life. So let's go ahead and welcome to the program, Elissa Graves. Hey, Elissa, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
So honored to have you. This is such an important conversation at this point in history. I mean, I guess at different times after the Dobbs decision was handed down, we were all making pit stops to figure out where we were, right? But there's a lot that's happened as of late and a lot coming down the pike. So again, to have your expertise is such a gift. So let's dive right in. To get started, I would love for you to give us an overview of the abortion landscape in the U.S. presently, 3.5 years after the Dobbs decision overturned Roe. Where do you think we are? What does the landscape look like right now?
So after Dobbs overturned Roe, what that did was return the issue of abortion to the states, to the democratic process. And so that has taken many different forms. And so the states are largely tasked with regulating abortion, whether or not to limit it, to ban it, to expand it. And since Dobbs, we've seen many different outcomes. So immediately after Dobbs, we had something called trigger bans take effect. And these trigger bans were in a handful of states like Texas, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and some others. These laws were passed before Dobbs happened and said, if Roe versus Wade is ever overturned, then abortion will become illegal within a certain period of time. So that meant that when Dobbs happened, a lot of these were then triggered and abortion became illegal. Some states also took the position that if they had banned abortion before Roe and they had not formally repealed those laws, which is very common, then they said that those already existing laws banned abortion. We saw that in a handful of states as well. So most of those trigger bans took effect a month or two after Dobbs happened. But aside from trigger bans, there's been a lot of legislation, and there's also been movement with state constitutional protections. So because the Supreme Court has made clear that the US Constitution doesn't protect abortion, then the states were tasked with determining, does our Constitution protect abortion? Should it protect abortion? So a handful of states already protected abortion at the state level, though it was very few. And so since then, there's been ballot measures and some judicial decisions that have found state constitutional protections for abortion. And a ballot measure is something that amends the state constitution that is voted upon by the public. And so we've had those happen in a handful of states. And those could go either way. They could go to where the abortion is protected by the state constitution, or it's not protected by the state constitution. And there's been quite a bit of movement in those in recent years. There was also some judicial decisions in California, Illinois, Kansas that interpreted the state constitutional protections and whether or not the state constitution already provided protection for abortion. So California said that the state constitution had the right to abortion, and this in 1969, before Roe even happened in 1973. Just what's important to remember is that every state's going to be different. That's really the way that the democratic process is meant to work. Now, I can't remember which Supreme Court justice said this, but it was essentially along the lines of, we want things to be in the democratic process because it's such a lesser burden on individuals. If they don't like the laws in their state, they can just move to a different state. Now, if we start going to what the Constitution protects on a federal level, and we say abortion is a right there, which it's not, but that would make it much more difficult for people. If they believed in abortion, they would have to move countries or things like that. And so really it's left with the states. The states get to decide how to limit abortion, whether or not to restrict it.
Yeah, yeah. You know, the idea that this issue is no longer stuck in a what I call constitutional deep freeze in and of itself is so encouraging, right? Because now we can get at the decision. And yes, I know the argument out there, which I share too, that unborn children are deserving of life, a right to life, that there is um, an argument for personhood, right? And at some point, we could go a couple steps down the road and actually see abortion outlawed in our nation. But whether we get to that through a patchwork of states or adding an amendment to the Constitution, or the Supreme Court finding personhood under the 14th Amendment, just to kind of allow you to maybe prognosticate a little bit, do you have a feeling as to which path forward is more likely or optimal? Do you even see that as a path that's viable within the next handful of years, or do you think it could take a while to get there?
I think it's probably unlikely that we'll have personhood protected under the Constitution, either by an amendment or through seeing what's already in the Constitution. As to an amendment, it's incredibly difficult to amend the Constitution. You see, it's been done very few times. It's been a very long time. They can't even get the political will together to pass an equal protection or the Equal Rights Amendment that's been pending since the 70s and things like that. So through an amendment, very doubtful, because there would have to be overwhelming support for it to pass. And I think where we are in our country, I just don't see that happening in the near future. Now, another route could say that the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection, due process of laws, there's something called there's substantive due process, which is a really high level legal concept of maybe there's rights that we have as Americans, but they're not said explicitly. They're substantive rights, and so they're implied. this was what Roe versus Wade essentially was. It was an implied right. And so we would have to go the other way and say there's an implied right to personhood. And you would have to look at the history behind that amendment, the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment was one of the Reconstruction Amendments passed immediately after the Civil War. And so you would have to find that history somewhere that says that an unborn child was considered a person at that time. And, I'm not a historian. So I don't know that history would be there. And we do want to limit substantive due process on some level because we don't want to imply rights that our Constitution wasn't meant to protect, because that's exactly what happened with Roe. So we don't want to go the other way either. But then again, if the history's there and we can show that history, it's a possibility. I don't think it's likely. What I do think is likely is that'll continue the way that it is. I don't think there should be a great concern with Dobbs being overturned. That I think Dobbs is here to stay because, again, when we're looking at these rights protected or not protected by the 14th Amendment, we look at the history when the 14th Amendment was ratified. And that's what the Dobbs decision did. It looked at that history and said, there is no history and tradition of a right to abortion. And so you can't go back and change the history of the late 1800s, thankfully. So therefore, I think Dobbs is here to stay.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I remember too, from I think a brown bag lunch talk at law school, one of my professors talking about how law tends to be downstream from culture. And so as we continue to win hearts and minds in our communities and in our states, we have hope to make them more and more pro-life and to gradually win the nation, and sometimes that feels like a tall order in states like California and New York and Oregon and beyond, right? But it is possible now that we could see that. But then the flip side is also true, that our pro-life states could become more pro-abortion. Do you have any thoughts on that, Elissa?
I think that's a very real fear. For a real example, that something that alarmed me was Arizona moved to protect abortion in their state constitution. I lived in Arizona for several years, and Arizona always kind of seems like this frontier state, this enterprising, very conservative minded state. And to see it in less than 10 years go from very pro-life to then enshrining abortion in the Constitution just shows me we really need to be on guard in our states. We can't just take our state's pro-life status for granted, even if that state has long been pro-life. I think we need to stay on guard. I think the other side is battling very hard to enshrine protections for abortion nationwide, even in places that traditionally have been hostile towards abortion. So we just need to stay aware and don't ever think of ourselves as completely safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it shows either way that change is possible. I'm a big believer that truth at the end of the day will win the day, right? That's the optimist in me too, and the lover of people that I am. But we've seen that. We've seen even Planned Parenthood gradually plummeting in their brand strength because people like you and me showed up and we did the hard work every day of praying and reaching out and with educational opportunities or undercover investigative journalism, all these beautiful collective efforts that really bring our case to the people. And that's what the Dobbs decision affords all of us, right? It's so important. There's another element of this decision that I think people sometimes forget, and it's the idea that, for example, Congress could pass a law in regards to abortion. Like people tend to think of this as just a state thing. But can you speak to that a little bit too, that this could be something that Congress picks up at some point, and is there a danger in that too?
Well, what's important to know is that Congress cannot overrule something that's in the Constitution. So they can't make a constitutional right. They could pass a law requiring management of or having some level of abortion, I think on some level, but I don't see that as a realistic possibility. I think you either direction, either saying that abortion is illegal nationwide or it's legal nationwide. There's just not the political will to do that. And if there was, it would have happened already. And so I've seen the Biden administration took the position in there's some federal laws that give federal money to hospitals, and they tried to say, so hospitals get Medicaid money through, and then they have something called it's EMTALA. It's an emergency medical act where emergency rooms, in order to receive federal funding, have to provide certain emergency services. So the Biden administration tried to hamstring abortion into EMTALA, calling it, well, this is an emergency. Therefore, if you don't provide abortions, you're not going to get federal money and things like that. So if that didn't work, and it didn't, in states where abortion is illegal, then I really don't think it's going to work where Congress would pass a law. I think we've seen what happened with Roe. It didn't settle the issue when Roe happened. It created nearly 50 years of discourse and debate. And so it's not going to be solved with a congressional act. And it's really something left to the states. You could even say that Congress would be overstepping their bounds. That's not something that Congress should be legislating unless it's somehow tied to federal funding. And that's what they try to do with EMTALA. And I just don't see that going over well politically.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick up on something else that you just brought up, and that is the fear, at least amongst pro-lifers, that Dobbs could be overturned someday and we'll have Roe all over again or some form of it, right? But you're pretty optimistic that that will not happen, even if the fabric of the court, the construction of the court were to change, right? So can you speak to that a little bit about why you think Dobbs is here to stay?
Sure. So abortion came from substantive due process, the implied right under the 14th Amendment. And so when we're looking at those rights, we have to look at the history when that amendment, the 14th Amendment, was passed. And so when Roe was decided, they said that history's there. And look, there was a history of abortion at the time the 14th Amendment was passed. And so you would say, well, history doesn't change. How did we get to Dobbs? Well, it turns out the history in Roe was very biased. It was done by a pro-choice researcher. It was essentially one historian. It wasn't a bunch of different historians and looking at different historical perspectives of these issues. When does life begin? And was abortion a right then? So Dobbs sought to correct that part of Roe. And so, of course, you would think that perhaps that could happen again. But I don't think that's logical. It's probably not going to happen simply because they took a really deep dive into the history of the 14th Amendment and how people at the time the 14th Amendment was passed thought of pregnancy and whether or not abortion was legal. They looked at it then and said, no, this was clearly not intended to be a right under the Constitution at that time. And thus, the Constitution doesn't protect it. I just don't see that they're going to be able to undo that unless we uncover some level of history unbeknownst to us after all these years of studying this exact issue. And that's just not going to happen. So I do envision issues coming up at the state level on whether or not abortion is protected. And even in states where abortion is prohibited, pushing back hard on that. In Texas, there's this constant debate over, so I believe it's only allowed in the life of or the health of the mother. And then the Texas Medical Board doesn't want to provide an opinion on what that means. And they're going back and forth. Well, when can you have an abortion? And so we're seeing that fight at the state level and exactly what state law means. So we're going to see much more of that than worrying about Dobbs being overturned.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's turn to chemical abortion in the courts. I'd love to get your thoughts on this new generic mifepristone that was just recently approved by the FDA, right? So one of the abortion drugs. There was this outcry when Trump's supposed pro-life FDA-ish made the decision to approve this. I heard it was kind of more of a procedural check mark, like you've got to approve the generic drug. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And then just kind of as a whole, this new frontier with chemical abortion, especially mail order chemical abortion, and what we can expect.
So, it does concern me that the FDA approved a generic form of mifepristone, but the FDA is very formulaic as well. It may have just been that it was the point in time where a generic was going to be released, because the mifepristone has been approved for over 20 years now. Now, there's a case currently pending against the FDA seeking to invalidate the original FDA approval of mifepristone. And that's kind of an interesting case because that case has been pending for a long time. It was initially brought by a network of doctors who were seeking to invalidate it. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the doctors don't have standing, which is a fancy lawyer way of saying they don't have a legal interest here. They cannot seek what they want. And so the Supreme Court really had no views on the merits of the case, which is whether or not the approval of mifepristone was valid. And so that was about a year ago. And since then, that has returned to the lower courts. And because the doctors could not seek to invalidate mifepristone, several states have now intervened. I believe Texas, Louisiana, maybe Florida have joined in and are saying we have an interest in it being invalidated. And so they are now seeking to invalidate the initial approval of mifepristone. So mifepristone has restrictions on it that have been updated about 3 times. And so they're trying to invalidate the initial approval and I believe some of the other restrictions if they can't get the whole approval withdrawn. So it kind of remains to be seen what will happen there. But if the plaintiffs, the states, are successful, it could invalidate the original approval of mifepristone, which would then probably put into jeopardy this generic mifepristone as well. And so kind of remains to be seen where that will go. There's a lot of evidence at the lower court, the trial court, that mifepristone was passed through in a way that was not appropriate. And the FDA drug approval process is kind of cloaked in darkness, trying to understand what goes on, what the FDA took into account. Did they properly take into account what happened? Have they properly looked at the injuries that have occurred to women? Do we have appropriate statistics related to this medication? So it'll be interesting to see. I think that case is really one to watch. It sounds legally very boring because it all hinges on, procedural administrative stuff within the FDA, but it could really undo the initial approval of mifepristone once and for all.
Yeah, it's going to be so interesting to watch because this is now the most prevalent form of abortion in America today. I want to say it's at least 64% of all abortions nationwide, whether women are walking into a facility or they're ordering them through the internet, right, from one of these so-called providers. And so, yeah, really, really interesting. And of course, we've got some of these cases where maybe, some of these drugs were sent from a state, maybe an abortion destination, at least a pro-abortion state, right? And they sent them into a pro-life state. And then what do you do? How do you regulate that? Who can you go after? That's going to be really interesting to watch as well, right? So I want to say there's a lawsuit pending in Texas right now over that, maybe even Louisiana, but I know a couple of our pro-life states have taken up that cause to see if they can prevent the flow of abortion-causing drugs into our state because we protect life here in the great state of Texas where you and I are based, right? So it can be really interesting to watch. One of the most contentious topics that has recently come up in the pro-life movement has been whether or not women should be prosecuted who have chosen abortion, right? So this is, for example, come up here in the state of Texas. A couple of prominent voices have brought this up, even though my read on the movement is that most people are against this. But you're board president of Sidewalk Advocates for Life, so I already know where you stand on this. But I'd love for you, just as an attorney, as a sidewalk counselor, as a wife and mom, maybe to speak to this as well, especially from the legal perspective. Do you think this is a good idea?
So, spoiler alert, I'm firmly against prosecuting women for abortion. But legally, I think it's a slippery slope to even consider prosecuting women for abortion, because this could lead to this, investigating miscarriages, stillbirths, things like that. I believe 1 in 3 pregnancies ends in miscarriage. And so could it be, we're going to open criminal investigations into every miscarriage? Did this woman have more than the approved amount of caffeine that you're supposed to have during pregnancy? It would be both very cruel and procedurally just unworkable to be able to prosecute abortion. And so I think, at least for now, we should prosecute providers because they are in a better position. Um, it's much more clear that they are committing a wrong. And it's easier on the legal side to prove that they committed a wrongful act. To prove that the woman did it has all these kind of other very emotional issues that would be brought into it. And I think more often than not, it would be cruel to subject women to this kind of prosecution, especially if she didn't have an abortion or ended her own pregnancy, if it was a traumatic, that she had a miscarriage. And I just don't see that being something that we should do as a society.
That's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about the miscarriage angle, but I'm sorry, keep going. Yeah.
Well, just, if many years from now, it could be theoretically, we could be in a place where you could say we could prosecute, but I just don't think, or I don't think that argument holds water because we'd have to have near universal agreement that abortion is wrong. I mean, we can pretty much universally agree that murder is wrong, but we would have to get to that same level of agreement to make it a criminal act. And I just don't think we're going to get there in our lifetime.
Yeah, yeah. I think as an attorney, as a sidewalk counselor, sidewalk advocate myself, one of the other things too that I look at is with every crime, there's a mens rea, a mental state, and then an actus reus, the action, right? And the idea is that there's a particular mental state that has to go with the action. Murder to me, murder is a legal term, right? Like murder is a legal term and it requires a certain mental state. And I can just say that after more than a couple decades of being out on the sidewalk, I don't think that that requisite mental state has been met. And I'm actually going to take a deeper dive in this in an upcoming hot take and actually look at this from all angles. But I think you bring up a really interesting point, Elissa, that it's much easier to go after the providers, follow the money, go after the money stream, right? That's going to be a lot more of an open shut case. As opposed to maybe going after a woman who could have been pressured by a family member. I mean, I have literally watched women get dragged in there by their mothers by the hair, right? Or boyfriends that grab her by the arm. And, you're trying to discern, wow, is this a case of forced abortion? I mean, we've had to make phone calls before to the police where it was clearly forced abortion, but there's a good percentage of women who say that they were being relentlessly pressured either emotionally or physically. And some people would say, well, that pressure doesn't matter. This child is about to die. I understand that. But when you are 15, 16 years old and you're being told that you're going to get kicked out of the house, you are suddenly in survival mode. And that's not a good reason to take the life of a child. But literally, that's how much some of these women go into survival mode. And so I'm just not there either with all the stories that I've heard on the sidewalk. Are there people who are cold-hearted and may have a hint as to what they're doing prospectively? But I've also found that some of the people who display the most ugliness on the sidewalk are the people who are most in crisis. It's really interesting. The other thing I'll mention too, just shameless pitch for couple of the past podcasts that we recorded on Maria's story, this mom that we helped, Texas mom who had a fully funded abortion, late-term abortion, first to Kansas and then to Washington, D.C. I mean, that D.C. abortion was scheduled for 26 weeks of pregnancy. And do you know, they were telling this mom who already had 2 children in her past, I mean, this is a low-income woman who doesn't have access to great health care. They literally told her, it's not a baby yet. It's going to be a heavy period at 26 weeks, right? And even though she's growing and she's showing and she's trying to figure all this out, she's going, gosh, TikTok is telling me this, the internet is telling me this, and this abortion clinic is telling me this. These women are in such a world of chaos and confusion. And then the idea that we would enter into that and then threaten jail or something, I'm just not there, right? I think that there's a greater conversation to unpack here, which again, we'll do in a future episode. But at the very least, these are things to take into consideration as we're weighing all of this. And again, my read after talking to colleagues across the movement is that the vast majority of people are against this for some of the reasons we've articulated and some of the other ones that we'll be bringing up on a future episode. So hang tight. But no, that's a great thought, Elissa. what are your thoughts going forward on the shifting abortion landscape? Do you see the pro-life movement continuing to gain ground? How do you think the battle might shift in the next couple of years? And then I'd also love to get your thoughts on defunding Planned Parenthood. We defunded them for 1 year. Do you think we could do it for 2, 5, or 10 years? What are your thoughts?
So, on the future of the pro-life movement, I really think the pro-life movement can gain ground. I think we've seen this shift in the recent years in Gen Z moving further toward religion than maybe, our generation. So I do think we can gain some ground there. But I do think, we need to be on guard. We need to make sure, keep our states pro-life that are pro-life and try to move the needle in places that are not pro-life, that are hostile. We've seen that change can and does happen in these states. So we need to be on the lookout for ballot initiatives, those state constitutional amendments through ballot initiative. People don't often vote in local elections, so they may not be aware it's something that's on the ballot. So we really need to stay on guard of that and get the message out if those things are happening. Maybe seeking ballot initiatives to protect life under state constitution and things like that. On the defunding angle and whether Planned Parenthood could be defunded for longer, I think for the length of a willing presidential administration, maybe we could get a defunding. And we'll see how this one goes. I think theoretically we could have a few more years of defunding. What's interesting about the defunding of Planned Parenthood through Medicaid is that Medicaid is a cooperative state federal program. It's generally administered by the states, and Planned Parenthood is very smart. They have structured their business in such a way to limit liability so that they cannot easily be defunded. So they run affiliates, and those affiliates operate in certain states, maybe a couple of states, maybe only one state, and they get money from those state Medicaid programs. And then PPFA, the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, the parent company, they don't provide any medical services. They don't bill Medicaid. But they're the ones that hold all the money. They're the ones that dole out the money to these affiliates that do bill Medicaid. And so that's been kind of the problem, that all the money comes from big Planned Parenthood, but they don't provide medical services. But surely the money is flowing in such a way that Medicaid dollars are impacting Planned Parenthood Federation of America. So it's really hard, all that to say, it's really hard to make the money stop flowing because they've made it hard to take the money away. And so usually it's left up to states to do that. The states determine whether or not Planned Parenthood will get money. So this federal defunding of Planned Parenthood is unprecedented. And so Planned Parenthood has filed a lawsuit challenging this defunding. The defunding's allowed to happen right now, but it's in kind of a weird legal limbo. So Planned Parenthood sued, saying that this law, defunding it, is what's called an unlawful bill of attainder. The Constitution prohibits bills of attainder. What a bill of attainder is a law aimed at punishment of a person or a group without a trial. So essentially, Planned Parenthood is saying this law defunding us is punishing us for providing abortions. You can't do that. This is a bill of attainder. And so initially, the district court, which is the lowest trial court, said, no, federal government, you can't do this. I'm going to put this on hold. And now it's gone up to, I believe, the 8th Circuit, the appellate court, and they said, hold on, we need time to decide this. We are going to say, we're going to let the law go into effect. So Planned Parenthood will be defunded while we think about this, while this appeal is pending. So we're waiting on them to rule. I can almost guarantee it's going to get to the Supreme Court eventually. And then we worry about the time running out and whether or not we'll really get an answer. So I'm hopeful that the 8th Circuit can get out an opinion quickly and go to the Supreme Court. So we haven't then run out of the year time they were defunded and the Supreme Court says, well, it's moot now. We can't decide this issue. So it remains to be seen. I think, again, that maybe defunding could happen simply for the length of a willing presidential administration.
Yeah, a really, really good background there. Yeah, and sometimes we forget that this is moving through the courts too, so we're keeping vigil as well. So good. Well, Elissa, could you give any words of encouragement to sidewalk advocates or others in the trenches right now, fighting the good fight, just as they look at this sometimes complicated landscape? I know there's a couple states that are still they're very pro-life that are still waiting for on court decisions. They're praying, they're hoping for the best, right? How would you encourage people in post-Roe America? Because I know that there's a lot of sometimes confusion and fatigue. I think so many of us expected that this decision would be handed down, and I mean, those of us that are attorneys knew a little bit better, right? But I think we expected something a little bit more simple in the landscape. Hey, we're going to go pro-life. Hey, we're going to go pro-abortion, and it'll settle pretty quickly. But that's not what we've seen. We've gotten almost like state whiplash, going, what's going on over here, and then over here, squirrel, shiny thing. We're trying to figure it out. Yeah. So, how would you encourage people forward in this sometimes confusing landscape?
What's really encouraging to me is that the big win has been won, that we are no longer fighting a losing battle. We now have that there is no constitutional right to abortion. And also that truth always prevails. And as long as we are out there speaking the truth and fighting for the truth, we are doing what is right. And we may not always be able to see the fruits of that, but it's working, absolutely. And we are really influencing the hearts and minds of America, even when we don't see it ourselves immediately. We see it in the changing culture. Even just recently with this awful assassination of Charlie Kirk, and how that's reinvigorated people about their faith, about their views, and how we need to come together. It's been really encouraging to see that movement that I think also goes along with the pro-life movement, and seeing a move more towards this love and care for our fellow man.
Yeah. Oh, such a beautiful thought. Again, let's not forget that law tends to follow culture, culture being the hearts of the people. And as you and I speak up, stand up, show up, advocate, and educate, we have hope that one day other states can follow the great state of Texas, right? And others will begin to embrace life and all of its dignity and all of its beauty and glory, this God given gift that we all have been given. So precious. It's so important. So, again, just with Elissa's wisdom and words here on the landscape, I encourage everybody forward. Don't give up. We've got this decision now back in our hands, and we can continue to do so much good with it. So, it's great. Elissa, thank you so much for your wisdom. Thank you for being with us. Really appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So important. Sometimes we just got to stop. We got to make a pit stop and say, it's like when you're in the mall, right? Where are we? Like, I don't know where I'm going sometimes. It can feel like that in post-Roe America. And so having experts like Elissa, or last week, like Dr. Michael New, just kind of giving us a little bit of that 30,000-foot view, and even diving in just a little bit deeper to understand better what's going on in some areas of the country. It's helpful. It's encouraging. And I'm sure some of you, depending on the state that you're in, are suffering from some discouragement, but rest assured, you have a chance to affect change. We've seen that time and again through prayer activities, educational opportunities, so many things that the pro-life, pro-family movement affords us, right? But the idea here is that our work is far from done. The Dobbs decision, as we know, has not ended abortion in our nation. It has only changed the way that the abortion industry operates. Yes, there are states that have banned or greatly restricted abortion. But for the women who live in those states, some of them are facing unexpected pregnancies. Abortion is still an option. They can go across state lines, right? They can obtain mail order abortion causing drugs and facilitate a literal DIY abortion at home. So, yes, Roe has been overturned, but we also have to keep vigil no matter where we live, recognizing that the abortion industry is still trying to push this on the American people. So, yes, we still have work ahead of us. And it's not only the work of reaching out to the abortion vulnerable women and men of our country, it's also the hard work of, at its root, changing hearts and minds about the inherent dignity of every human life in the innate evil of abortion. It's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. But what that declaration leaves out is every human being's right to life. In other words, from the first moment that he or she exists, that we exist, once conceived, our right to have a chance to be born. Enlightening people on this point is one of the most important tasks we face, along with supporting pregnant moms who are being coerced into abortion by their partner, by their parents, by the fear of losing a job or leaving their education incomplete, by economics or societal reaction. That's where we as a society need to focus, not on creating new avenues to the violence and horror of abortion, to the trauma of abortion, but really reaching out a human helping hand and reminding women that they are strong enough, that they have options and resources, hope and help available to them through our local pregnancy resource centers. We as Sidewalk advocates are so privileged to refer to them, right? And of course, as a people of faith and conscience, this is our call to be there for those who cannot speak for themselves, to reach out to the orphan and the widow and to journey with them and remind them that they are not alone. Such a powerful thought. All right. Well, with that, thank you again for joining me for another episode of the Laura Musica Show. We'll be back here next Friday at 9 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Central on the Sidewalk Advocates for Life Facebook page, YouTube channel, or wherever you get podcasts. Thanks so much, everybody.